Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group Freshwater Wash Community of Practice webinar. Just a heads up to everyone, today's presentation is being recorded. I've already begun. So by participating in today's presentation, you are agreeing to be recorded and to be a part of that recording. As you connect, just a kind reminder for housekeeping, please make sure you're muted unless you're interacting with our presenter and asking a question. There will be different times for question and answering, and we will cue you for those. My name is Colleen Sorto. I am the Director of Development Partnerships at Conservation International, which includes leading our WASH and Watersheds initiative. As part of this work too, I'm also the ABCG Freshwater Wash Task Lead. And I've been working on efforts to integrate these two sectors for about 10 years now. Today's meeting is hosted by our community of practice, which aims to share information among those working on this intersection across sub-Saharan Africa. When there's not a global pandemic and we're able to meet in person, this group is anchored in Nairobi, but we also meet in the virtual spaces for webinars, as well as to exchange information on our LinkedIn group. I'm going to ask you all, if you could, in the meeting chat, introduce, if you haven't done so already, introduce yourself, your affiliation, and potentially even where in the world you might be calling in from today. And just a reminder, if you haven't muted, please do so, because we do expect quite a number of people on today's call. Before I turn off my video, I'm just going to introduce today's speaker. Today we have Ele Jan Saaf, who is the founder and managing director of Saaf Consult BV, which is a consultancy that focuses on water, environment, and renewable energy. I imagine there's going to be a lot of things that in those areas are going to pick up in today's conversation. He's bringing more than 24 years of working in this space, and he's worked with many influential actors such as the World Bank, KfW, GIZ, the African Development Bank, IUCN, WWF, Wetlands International, and national and local governments, just to name a few. Immediately after Ele Jan's presentation, we've saved some time for Q&A with you. He may ask you to indicate in the chat if you have questions or if you have moments where he would like to interact with you, or you can also type questions in the chat and I can save them and bring them back to the conversation when we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn off my own camera and pass it to you, Ele Jan. Ele Jan, you're still muted. But thank you for listening to that instruction.
I am always making that mistake. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for that silly mistake. I see a lot of interesting names and organizations in the chat box. This is very exciting. I just wanted to also clarify right off the bat that at the moment I'm here on behalf also of Wetlands International as part of the Watershed program, although I am indeed a private consultant. So, right, what I found is that these webinars, these presentations tend to be too much a one-sided conversation, and I don't want to be the one guilty of that as well. So before I start with and launch into my presentation, I'd like to ask you if you would be so kind as to quickly in a few words write in the chat what you would expect to be taking away from this presentation today. If you don't have anything to expect, if you don't quite know what I'm going to be talking about, feel free to not put anything. But if anybody has specific items that I'd really like to mention, please spend a few, just a minute or two putting that in the chat box. And I'm looking and reading in the meantime. Colleen, would you be so kind as to put my presentation up? Thank you very much. Okay, as you can see on the first slide, this is part of a Watershed activity. Watershed is a program funded by the Dutch government and has been running for almost 4 years now. It's coming to its end. and is a collaboration between 4 major NGOs. This is IRC, Wetlands International, ACFO, and CIMAVI, in cooperation with a lot of partners in our focus countries. So it's a very, very international activity and experience. I'm going to be talking about IWRM and WASH linkages. That's sort of the core element of this presentation. Colleen, next slide, please. Right, to start out with, very complex, confusing, not very professional scheme, which I developed, I must be 15 years ago, in my thinking about IWRM and WASH and all the other aspects of IWRM. The reason I put this here as a first slide is not to confuse you or not to give you the impression that it's all very complex, but just to indicate that in yellow, water for drinking water, WASH, is a client of IWRM. And because of this fact, I would say, which please feel free to discuss that with me later on, we talk about linkages between IWRM and WASH and not about integration. So I see here one question, the added value of integration to efficient delivery of SDGs. I think that's very crucial, and I'll even try to link it to some of the COVID-19 implications that we are suffering at the moment. But please take away from this slide the fact that provision of water for drinking water schemes, WASH schemes, is part of the tasks and responsibilities of an integrated water resource management system, person, organization. Colleen, would you mind doing the next slide? Colleen?
I've advanced it. Sorry if the delay is.
Oh, I see. Must be something in my.
It might just be. Can others in the see the
It's
slide?
working for me. I can see the schematic linkages. Go ahead.
Yes,
there we are.
There we go. Thank you very much. It's there it is. Okay, so this beautiful schematic developed by Arjan Naafs, who is also part of the team. We're all working on this issue at Watershed. Seeks to illustrate these linkages between WASH and IWRM. So very simply, the big blue arrow of water flow is either a river, a stream, but could also very much be groundwater, and we'll come to that in a minute. It's just a schematic, so it's an illustration, it's figurative. And then the abstraction of the water for a drinking water scheme, for a WASH scheme, is the blue curved arrow on the right-hand side, and that's the first linkage between IWRM and WASH. Subsequently, the water is used in the WASH system, and wastewater, fecal sludge, is disposed on either open water bodies or in the ground, and this often flows back into either the same or a similar water flow used by others. So you have another linkage there between IWRM and WASH. So this is the central theme of this presentation. And this is also where we want to argue that we talk about linkages and not integration. So if I may ask for the next slide, we will see what is known as a common state of affairs, which means that we have pollution of a water source from latrines, whether it's in open water or whether it percolates to groundwater and then enters into the wells or the abstraction zones of water hand pumps. So consider the following: disposal of wastewater in an open water source for downstream users and subsequent changes in water quality, and also other water quality issues. Again, the provision of safe drinking water, the intake for the WASH scheme, is the responsibility of IWRM tasks. And that's where the first linkage is, and the disposal of the wastewater back into the system, it comes back into the IWRM realm. So these are two main linkages that we talk about. If I go to the next slide, now it's much faster, very good. This is where we really go into the nitty-gritty, and please bear with me and feel free even during my presentation to ask if I'm not presenting it clearly to you. In that case, please just interrupt verbally and not via the meeting chat, because I'm focusing on the presentation. There's an institutional divergence for WASH and IWRM, and there's conceptually also a difference. So IWRM is a management concept. In other words, IWRM is responsible for providing water at the right place, at the right time, of the right quality, of the right amount for WASH services, or also for ecosystem services, or for transportation, or for industry, or for tourism. There are many different clients for IWRM. So it's a management concept. WASH is a service delivery concept. It takes the water that has been allocated to it, makes sure that it's available as safe drinking water to either smaller rural populations or larger cities, and then ensures that the disposal of the wastewater is done in a hygienic fashion. So it's a service delivery concept. So there are parallels. Both are participatory and inclusive. In other words, it's very important in both cases to be working with the beneficiaries, and both have a strong gender focus, which is obviously very crucial for any kind of sustainability. So it's easy to understand why initially the thinking, and Watershed also, was let's try to integrate these two. But that really became quite difficult because of these institutional divergences and the fact that they are conceptually different. So, Colleen, the next slide, please. What can be done? Well, some of the obvious issues, of course, are can the latrines be moved to another location, further away from the water source? Can the wastewater be treated from the water source? Can maybe some of the wastewater even be reused? Can the sources of water pollution be reduced at the source, or can the water be used more efficiently? I haven't yet gone into the issue of efficiency, but that too is an important aspect of sustainable WASH, to make sure that the water source that is used is sufficient for the population that it has to serve. And again, that is a link to IWRM. Next slide, please. So in Watershed, we have a strong focus on lobby and advocacy. And we have a strong focus on messaging and working with CSO partners in our countries to make sure that they are able to develop messaging and identify the target group for their lobby and advocacy activities within this complex sphere of IWRM and WASH. So what we did is we developed messages and guidelines for discussions in the field to clarify, first of all, where the links are. So you must imagine if, as a lobby and advocacy worker, you're working in the field and you go to a village and you talk to the responsible authorities about the linkages between IWRM and WASH, then it has to be kept at a very basic level for the very simple reason. It's more important to get a message across than to give a lecture about IWRM as a fairly complex concept and the link to WASH. So clarifying where the links are is really important. Using visual tools and using actually field visits to go and show that. Secondly, for lobby and advocacy, the messaging has to focus what can realistically be done. We've had examples in our countries where people wanted to treat water from large ponds in a fairly expensive way so that it could be used for drinking water. Now, the economic aspect and the has to be taken into account there as well. And it's quite difficult if you come up with messaging that is then focused on unrealistic concepts. Thirdly, the pitfall of technical discussions on what IWRM and WASH mean and how they are linked. So again, I remember when we were working, for example, in Mali, half a day was spent on the discussion as to whether or not lobby and advocacy workers needed to understand the IWRM concept. And I compared it in the discussion to the question as to whether to drive a car you need to know how it's built and what the specific standards are for the car that you're driving. And the conclusion was quite soon, no, we don't. We just need to learn how to drive it. So this is where we focus. We focus on the linkages, where they come together. So for lobby and advocacy, we have to avoid the pitfall of entering into technical discussions and trying to train people on IWRM when all they need to know is how it affects their wash systems and how to address these linkages. So I've written here in the slide, compare slides 3 and 4. That was the schematic link and the drawings. We could go back to that. Finally, a very important point is to link up with other initiatives working on the same or similar issues, which is why we're talking to you, in fact. So this is one of the many attempts that we do, because there are always small differences and nuances in terms of understanding, in terms of interpretation, in terms of adaptation, application that are really relevant to take into account. So that's also why I'm quite looking forward to our discussions just a little bit later to try to understand whether our approach that we've developed in Watershed makes sense to you, or whether you have experiences that may actually affect our interpretations and our work. That's how we all learn from each other, and that's how it all becomes better. So these are the 4 main bullet points for lobby and advocacy. Yeah, please go ahead to the next slide. I wanted to bring this home a little bit because a lot of slides with schematics and drawings and bullet points are a bit abstract. Here in this picture, what you see is a truck dumping fecal sludge, basically taken from latrines, outside of Bamako city in Mali in an open field. Now, this is just not one truck. I mean, this is one truck, but this was happening all day long. We're talking about 20 trucks, 25 trucks a day, day in, day out, just on the outskirts of the city, close to the airport. And what happened, and we more or less walked the whole trajectory, is that this water, this highly polluted water, which was taken from latrines and cesspits from households in Bamako city, very slowly flows back to the Niger River. And it flows directly through the communities, a very, very black, thick flow, and then enters the Niger River just above an intake point of the drinking water company. So it's a beautiful, well, beautiful maybe in brackets, example of how IWRM and WASH linkages are really important, because in this case, the disposal of the water and the fact that it's not treated, that it's not really in any way kept separate from the water source, immediately affects the intake of the urban water systems. So that's just an example to make it more concrete. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what have we done as Watershed? Well, first of all, I'd like to say Watershed is a large program. We have a lot of colleagues, and we've done a lot of work in the past almost a year on trying to come to terms with these linkages. So several publications were developed, including a position paper, which Colleen will provide a link for at some stage during this presentation, so that you can download that. It's a brief position paper, but it sets out the main directions, and we have fleshed that out with other documents as well. We've worked in our countries, various workshops before COVID-19 got us in our grip. And there is the link to the IWRM WASH position paper in the chat box. And then when COVID came in, we started thinking, what can we do to retain our contact with our country work packages and with our CSOs? So we started developing what we called Watershed dialogues, which initially was the idea to just be proactive on social media, mainly on Facebook, but also on other social media platforms by posting some of the lessons we'd learned, some of the insights, some of the experiences, and trying to entice people to comment and have a dialogue. In fact, that wasn't too successful, so this evolved into virtual field visits, and that was very effective. So also very much thanks to Arjen's work, we used Facebook Live and Zoom to actually visit field locations where IWRM WASH linkages were very visible, and we discussed them with local stakeholders, people on site, and people could interact from all over the world in real time. So that these virtual field visits helped to clarify for many people what we meant with these IWRM WASH linkages and what we could do in terms of lobby and advocacy to address these. We developed lobby and advocacy field guidelines. You've seen some of them in some of the drawings / cartoons that I have used in my slides. These are mainly meant for local lobby and advocacy field workers to engage with their counterparts and to have a discussion, to set their memory points to remember this is where we are, this is what we need to achieve, so that they don't get lost in the complexity of what is IWRM and why is it shouldn't be integrated with WASH and these kinds of discussions. Then each country package has been very active with their specific CSOs in their countries, developing messaging and providing capacity building in terms of what, how, where, when, and why, and how it relates to the linkages. And then we've been engaging with international CSOs like yourselves and with several networks in Africa and in Asia. And we also have a Dutch angle to the work, trying to influence our government and our CSOs to be aware and to engage with these IWRM WASH linkages. So these are the elements of my presentation at this stage. I realize that some of these can still be unpacked. So I would be very interested at this stage to see if there are any questions, requests for clarifications that I could answer before we go into discussion. So I'm going to hand back to Colleen for this phase of the presentation.
Thank you, Ele Jan. I will give it just a second for if people want to type questions or clarifications. I myself have a question to sort of jump off with into the discussion portion, but I want to definitely give time to those who are on our virtual floor to also either raise their hand, type a chat, or unmute and step in. Okay. Well, while they're gathering their thoughts, I'm gonna come back with there are things within your presentation that you said that I really love and I responded to strongly, and there were others that actually I found weren't as in sync with my philosophy to how I approach this work. And I think when you talk about integrated water resource management and whether, and the car example of like, do you have to know how it's built or do you just know how to use it? I mean, I think in the sense of advocacy, at least from my experience working with the ABCG teams and with Conservation South Africa and in JGI in Uganda, that is true in the sense of like, how do you put it together when you're taking it to decision makers? And, you talked about complexity versus simplicity and clarity. Totally agree with that aspect of it. But the part that I'm going to bring in here, which I think is sort of a nuance in the way that I think about it, I think if we look at this integrated linked dynamic, I think my challenge that I offer is, in my perspective, I actually think that depends on sort of where you sit within the scheme. And I think there are a lot of sort of man-made systems or kind of institutions that anyone who's working on water are interacting with, especially if you're looking at policy and running management schemes. And we certainly have to think about how we work and adapt. So those of us as professionals absolutely are seeing this like link, where's my part of it? But I would actually challenge, and again, this is my perspective, that integration really does matter when it comes to the level of community stewardship. So when you brought it home and you talked about that example in Mali, the people who live in that village and are right there and see those trucks drive through that water source, they actually need it all integrated because it's their life, and it's about how they message and how they understand it. And they definitely don't have to understand it to the degree of being able to be a mechanic to work on the system, but you at least have to know what are the main parts of the system so that when it breaks down on me, I can at least flag someone to help me. I would sort of offer back that that first piece of the discussion of, do you think the integration versus linkage is really, like across the board and really solid within the experience, or do you think that there might be sort of different perspectives depending on where in the sort of water chain you are?
Well, Colleen, personally, I feel that if you try to integrate the two, it leads to a lot of complexities, and what I've seen in our Watershed program, to a lot of confusion and unnecessary effort, work, time lost, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. Having said that, I fully appreciate that obviously this is only one position, and that from your experience, you may have other experiences which lead you to suggest that integration is a better option. From my conceptual point of view of the two concepts, you cannot integrate them, and you do not need to integrate them. But I don't want to dispute at all that there may be other positions and circumstances in which that might be relevant. And I'd be interested to understand, for example, in which cases you're thinking of.
Thanks, that's really fair of you. I'd actually like to open that to our participants. Those of you on the line, do you have experience working either on one side of these issues or working on both sides, looking at this sort of more either integrated water resource management, ecosystems, services, provision, protection approach, or from the WASH side? Really love to hear from you all. Should we even be engaging in an integration versus linkages debate? And, what resonates with you? And we welcome you to unmute yourself and offer your response, to type it in the chat, or to indicate with the hand in Teams your interest to offer a comment.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. This is Jimmy L. Mandima with the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Thanks again for the overview. First of all, I think the integration versus linkages could just be a question of context, but to me, just from a practical standpoint, I think the value of cross-referencing is based on when you are working on watershed conservation, and then the other entities on sanitation issues, especially groundwater, tapping on that, being able to cross-reference and understand how the systems are coordinated is important, because if they are not kind of coordinated, it becomes a challenge on where you take off the water and even understanding how the dynamics of the catchment is working. And then I think the point that Colleen raises of just the actual custodians, often the communities out there, it helps them to set up governance systems that are more efficient and therefore deliver better. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy L. Do others have thoughts they'd like to offer?
Okay, thank you.
And Ele Jan, before I give you a chance to kind of respond to Jimmy L, I also wanted to just bring back in his earlier comment when he was looking at, this added value of efficiency for reaching SDGs. We sort of touched on that when we were looking at sort of thinking about these linkages for operationalizing these connections in country, and then sort of how might maybe thinking about it with these schematics get us closer to these very large, ambitious, important goals.
All right, shall I move ahead, Colleen, with responding to
Yes,
Jimmy's? So it's a very interesting observation, and I think maybe what's coming out here is a slightly different angle and also a slightly different focus. See, from our perspective, we've been looking at lobby and advocacy to target changes in behavior on these linkages, which is why maybe I should qualify what we're suggesting is that we should talk about linkages between IWRM and WASH when trying to develop lobby and advocacy messages and approaches. However, from Jimmy's perspective, of course, it makes sense to say yes, but we need to understand the dynamics to be able to also inform stakeholders and beneficiaries and explain to them how these dynamics work. That is a different focus, but equally relevant. So I guess what you could say here is that maybe this is where the two diverge, in the sense that for lobby and advocacy, I would strongly suggest not to try to integrate the two. But when you're talking about conservation and engaging with communities in terms of explaining to them how the dynamics of the water cycle work and how it affects their livelihoods, that some element of IWRM has to be included, and some sort of link to WASH has to be explained. But again, I would try to really look at the dynamics themselves rather than clothing it in terms of an IWRM concept, which is fairly complex and doesn't really serve a purpose in terms of engaging with stakeholders.
I think those are important clarifications. And actually, I think we've got, thanks to Tara for her question, she asked us to kind of bring it back down and ground it a little bit more. An example for either from you, I'm happy to offer one as well, or others on the call who can talk about what they are perceiving as the difference between integrating and linking in practice. And specifically then, Ele Jan, I'd like to take it to that within an advocacy, lobby and advocacy focus. So I can offer an example, but I would like to give you first from a watershed perspective. Can you talk a little bit about specifically how they've taken this understanding of the links and how that functions within an advocacy platform?
Okay, also, thank you, Tara. That's a good question. So an example, when I joined the Watershed program, looking back at some of the documentation activities that had taken place, there had been attempts to provide IWRM training to lobby and advocacy groups at rural level. People with only primary education and very engaged in their daily work, who were also on the side trying to run the CSO and do lobby and advocacy activities to improve their lives. And I was at some of these sessions, and it was one and all confusion because the concepts were complex, the relevance for their daily lives was not clear. And I realized together with Arjen and others that we don't need to talk about the concepts as such. That is much more something for us as practitioners, advisors, parts of trying to understand the concepts than for the people working on lobby and advocacy in the field, the practitioners at that level. So then we said, okay, we have to talk about the linkages. So we only need to illustrate and we need to show where these linkages are. The rest is actually it can basically stay in the dark, as it were, because it doesn't benefit their work and their application and the effectiveness of the way they can operate. So that's maybe an example that I can offer, but I'd be very interested to hear others. Maybe Arjen, who's also on the call, would like to add something. He just raised his hand.
Yes, please phone a friend. Arjen, please.
Sure, if we are continuing for the $1 million question, would be great. I was going to give an example from Kenya, which is Kajiado County, where as Watershed, we're working a lot with citizenship engagement and citizens accountability and working with civil society organizations. And they had a lot of concerns about drinking water for their municipal community. And that was basically their issue. Are we sure that it is enough and that it's going to be secure water quality? And when we looked at it, of course, we could be talking about rainwater harvesting or different methods of enhancing the quantity of water. But what we found was actually that they were all relying on groundwater. And basically, on top of it, at the top of that catchment where they were having their water pumps, there was a landfill. And that landfill was polluting the groundwater. So where we were working was specifically advocacy on having the landfill relocated or better protected so as that it doesn't pollute the groundwater. And that was somewhere where we were zoning in and focusing on where there was actually a linkage between what you want to do at a wider water resource management component and what is needed for WASH sector. That's an example, what we have been looking at. We've got other examples in Bangladesh where people are relying on their drinking water from very deep groundwater, which is very reliable and high quality. The only difficulty is that, of course, we don't know how long it's going to last. It's an aquifer where 60 million people are depending on. So it's a matter of making sure that people are using other sources of water for everything else, and therefore working on the recreating and restoration of ponds so that people are using that water for animals and for irrigation and things like that, so they don't start using the groundwater that needs to be reserved for drinking water because it's so high quality and needs livelihood. Those two examples I'm giving. And one thing, once again, we are working a lot with civil society organizations and making sure that it is an issue that people can work and focus on, and having that linkage for advocacy. You have to get down to your point. Just saying we have to do WASH and IWRM basically is doesn't entice people to really engage with it. Get to a clear focus on that. That's where you have to focus on linkages. Back over to you, Colleen.
Thanks, Arjen. Yeah, I mean, I think the Kajiado County example in Kenya is one that APCG members, and specifically this community of practice, is familiar with as well. We had Samuel Jakenda and Jacobo, I'm forgetting his last name, but two really smart partners who came and chatted with us and shared those examples a while back, which actually spurred our work with IRC on the advocacy guide for our work. And I think, you make some really good points. And, I was going to offer the example of Conservation South Africa's work in the Mzimvubu, where you're absolutely right when it comes to the point of like community stewardship, or as you've said, of like the people who are living in and around the water sources and their daily actions are making changes. So in the Bangladesh example, you talked about the landfills and being aware. In the CSA example, it's changing people's behavior when it comes to how they graze their cattle and water sources. But specifically from that advocacy perspective, I also think maybe I take away and really reinforce, absolutely, it's about what language is most effective. The farther we get into either side of what corner of the water sector might you feel most comfortable in language, the farther you get away from the most important point. And I just say from our experience within the working in Mzimvubu and the upper catchment there, we noticed a really important connection when it came to advocacy and sort of how messages were delivered, in the sense of our colleagues were having meetings with partners in the district municipality in which the very local challenges and connections of this were being discussed. But then it also included field and site visits out to these places where we were seeing these challenges and where change was needed. But it was really important for our example for local stakeholders to be able to articulate some of those connections. Perhaps it is more of a LinkedIn perspective because it's sort of how they see it. But I just maybe like to say it's one of the carrying thoughts we take away of, maybe if we spend a lot of time in linkages versus integration, we may sort of lose the point, as Aryan, you've just sort of kind of said there, and also Jimmy L's of context and, thinking about sort of who are the custodians or who are the guardians and their actions, and maybe it's about thinking about different audiences. I'm going to give a chance if others have questions or examples that they'd like to offer. I think this is a very rich discussion, and I think it's great to have it, but also really reinforce and I'm excited by that point of ultimately it's not the language, but it's what happens. And those examples in Bangladesh and Kajiado County in Kenya, and CSA's experience and JGI's in Uganda really speak to that as well. So other questions from the floor or comments even?
Yeah, maybe Colleen, just to what you said just triggered this. Maybe what we're trying to do within Watershed is to adapt the language to actually change behavior. Maybe that's one way of saying it within the context of our discussions here. That the language initially at the beginning of the Watershed program was at a level that wasn't understood. And we're trying to bring it down to a level where it's understood and people respond. You can see the glint in their eyes, the recognition, saying, oh yes, of course, now I know what you mean. Right, let's do this. How do I do it? And then we have the tools ready to say, okay, this is how you do it. And I can imagine that in different contexts, that language would be different. But in the end, it's about actually, getting the changes in behavior. So just want to offer that comment on the basis of what you said.
Yeah, I agree. We just had something that popped up in the comment that said add perspectives related to the SDGs. Also welcome, I think, though you already kind of touched on them. I only bring them up because water touches key SDGs. So when it comes to what Watershed has learned, bringing lobbying and advocacy within its programming and sort of how those experiences kind of add up to this larger SDG goal. Do you have some thoughts to offer, Ele Jan?
Actually, I do, but I'd have to go back to our position paper because we have clearly identified in that how this SDG, how the SDGs are part of this whole thing. But off the top of my head, it's all about ensuring access to safe drinking water. So ensuring that the water that is actually provided is safe, and that's where the IWRM link comes in. And at the other end of the system, again, to make sure that you do not pollute water for others, and that you don't leave anyone behind in terms of your interventions. So there are linkages, but I'd like to refer to our position paper, unless maybe Aryan has more at hand to offer for that. Otherwise, I'd refer to the position paper.
I'm trying to pull it up now, but this is clearly testing my team's ability.
Yeah, I was trying the same, but I couldn't find it quick enough. Aryan just posted something interesting in terms of organizing a virtual field work. There are some examples of our virtual field visits on Facebook on the Watershed Dialogues page. And you can click on them and have a look at how they were. And it is very easy to also adapt that approach to your environment. You can see, there it is. Aryan has put up his hand. Colleen, may I ask Aryan to...
Please.
Just go exactly to where you are now. It's basically the two takeaways that are there. So when you're looking at WASH and IWRM, and when we're talking about linkages, we want to see where do they actually, are they connected? And there are two questions you can ask. One is where and how is WASH, in particular drinking water, under threat due to problematic water resource management? Or if you want to put it in SDG questions, where is SDG 1 under threat from problematic SDG 6.4, 6.5? The other way around, which the WASH sector normally doesn't think about so much in the wider context, is what pollution problematic WASH is giving to the wider ecosystems and other users of water, which is the second question. Or if you want to put in SDG linkages, where is SDG 6.2 a threat to SDG 6.3 and 6.5? Now, the main point of this is that when you're in the WASH sector, you normally look at the quality of water coming in. And of course, there's a whole process of fecal sludge management, but that is done more from a health perspective driven in general. If you have a IWRM linkages look at it, you want to see that that sanitation doesn't pollute river bodies and therefore getting too much growth of algae or other different types of influences from that. So those two questions focus on where the water comes into your WASH system and where from your WASH system it goes out into the wider water debate. That's where the linkages are. And whenever you're in an area, look at those and try to identify those points. And that will help A, to do advocacy, but B, also to see what interventions could be possible to improve either of those two. Back over to you, Colleen.
Thanks, Arya. I think you put it down into a very practical lens, and I appreciate it, and I find what you just shared extremely helpful. Before I go to my sort of final slide and sort of wrap a few things up, I just want to give one last opportunity to those who are connected with us to either offer a verbal comment, raise your hand, or indicate and share experience. Or just hear someone other than our voices. Okay. Well, with that, I just want to say, if you'd like to learn more about Watershed's work, they have experience in addition to the one shared, there was experiences in Ghana and Uganda, and the link to their website is there. The link to the position paper is higher up within the chat, as well as this recording will also be made available within our community of practice. Just a reminder, if you have listened to this and said, yeah, integration, linking, whatever, it's really more important to get to the action. ABCG also kind of agrees with that momentum. That's why we collaborated with IRC to put together this freshwater conservation and WASH. Not quite as complex as integrated water resource management, but definitely looking at that ecosystem WASH connection. And we've created an advocacy strategy workshop guide, which takes you through an 8-step process on how do you design that advocacy strategy, thinking about those different audiences. And as Ele Jan offered, adapt the language to change behavior, maybe in different aspects. There's a link to the ABCG guide there in that second bullet. And if you're interested in sharing your experiences, Aryan earlier said, if you want to organize a virtual field visit and see how things look in the field, reach out to him. His email is included higher up in the chat. Or if you're interested in a forum similar to this one, where you're coming and sharing experiences and reflections, which you think will be helpful to other practitioners as they address these integrated or linked dynamics working in somewhere within sub-Saharan Africa, please send me an email, and we welcome the opportunity to share and learn with more partners. So I think with that, I will thank you for adding that link. And with that, I will just thank everyone for your participation today and remind you that if you haven't already joined that community of practice, oh, wait, 1 second, we just got a question. It says, is there a practical example of IWRM and WASH linkages tools focusing on transboundary water management? Watershed colleagues, take it away, because
Off the top of my mind, I mean, Arjen also raised his hand, but off the top of my head, I would say we don't have any. We might actually have some examples of transboundary water resource issues, but in the terms of transboundary, we look at within country across provinces, within country across more regional boundaries. It gets more complex. The IWRM elements are related to the WASH, because if the WASH system pollutes water resources and they flow further downstream to be used by others, then you get more of an issue there. But I see Arjen is also referencing the Water Aid initiative on the Ganges River. So please, Arjen, please elaborate.
Yes, there is an initiative which combined experiences happening in Nepal, happening in India, and happening downstream in Bangladesh along the Ganges River. And basically, what was being done there was making sure that people anywhere along the river are aware of their influence, of their behavior for the downstream colleagues. Either being what India does affects what people have in Bangladesh, or the people in Nepal, what happens into India. And though it wasn't an example where I would say it went to wider transboundary agreements, it was somewhere where we were looking at various countries and exchange visits as well, to make the understanding of what happens upstream influences downstream. And within India, that led to something called Jal Chopal, which is a democratic forum for water issues at district level. I'll try to still put in a link to one of the papers on that. Back over to you, Colleen.
And with that also, thank you, Lisa, for that. I'm sorry, I was trying to do too many things at once. Thank you for that question. I think also just to say that's a great one that I will post within the community of practice to see if maybe there are others who are working in sub-Saharan Africa who have that question. It's great to have the link and this water aid example from India, and perhaps maybe just a challenge out there to our community of practice. Is there one happening in Africa? Jimiel had also offered that water commissions in Southern Africa, the Zambezi, Orange, Okavango, and Nile systems might be another area where we might look to see, are these types of tools being applied? And we're looking at it from a transboundary system of this integrated view in those basins. So absolutely. So with that, I think we have about, 6 minutes left before we're officially closed. Thank you. We've had great participation. I think we've had, at several points, we had close to 40 participants on this call. I look forward to posting the recording as well as some of the resources within the community of practice. And again, reach out to me if you have experience, or especially if you have experience with looking at this in a transboundary context. I think I will offer that. And as a final, I will actually pass it back to Ele Jan to give the formal close and just say thank you very much on behalf of the community of practice for being here today and for your presentation. Ele Jan.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Colleen. I actually, as we're talking about this transboundary issue, I wanted to maybe caution a little bit without hoping not to sound too pedantic here, but at least from our watershed perspective, we're talking about the linkages between IWRM and WASH at WASH level. If you're going to transboundary levels where the behavior of one country influences the water quality of another country downstream, you go into a completely different realm in that sense. And then different experiences, different legislation, different practices come into play. And I would actually caution a little bit to make, again, just like with the IWRM issue, don't make it more complex than it needs to be in terms of working at WASH level, WASH systems level, and IWRM linkages. That's really the focus, at least for us. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention and your work. And please feel free to reach out to Arjen or myself at any time. I'm just going to put my email address here in case you have any questions or you need any materials. And I wish you all best of luck with your work and your endeavors. Thank you.
Absolutely. Super. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your participation. Maria, I saw your comment, and just to say, we have a lessons learned from the ABCG work implementing this integrated approach, and then we're producing a advocacy strategy application lessons learned in the works now. So stay tuned, more coming from ABCG. So with that, thanks all very much. It was great to have you connected with us today. And please join the LinkedIn group, and there'll be even more resources posted on there shortly.
Thank you.